Hello everyone, it's Infinity Gamer here, and in this video I'm going to explain the different deployment types available to you in Infinity Code 1. Now I'm not going to go too heavy into the strategies of deployment because that's very situational on the army you have, the list you've brought, and the map, as well as your opponent and when you're going and the objective. So what I'm just going to do here is just explain how you use each of the different deployment types, what it means, and maybe a couple of things that you need to factor in when you're deploying troops. Notice that I've got an example map here. It's terribly laid out. There's not enough terrain. It's just a hodgepodge of everything I have. More to show you some of the restrictions and the requirements that maybe you need to factor in with deployment. So what we're going to do first is just generally talk about standard deployment. Now, different missions might have different rules around deployment, but generally, if a model doesn't have any specific deployment rules in its profile, then you have to deploy it normally, which usually means that you get a designated deployment zone and the model has to deploy within it. Now, they can deploy prone, they can deploy touching cover, they can deploy tucked behind some scenery, but that's pretty much it. They need to stick within their deployment zone, and obviously once they're deployed, they're kind of deployed. So what are the non-standard deployment types? Well, we have forward deployment, we have infiltration, we have parachutist, and we have combat jump. We also have another special skill which isn't directly linked to deployment, but because it throws a bit of a curveball, I'm going to include it, and that's camouflage. So let's go through the different deployment types. Starting with forward deployment, different models will have forward deployment listed on their special skills, and also how far forward they can deploy from your deployment zone. You can deploy that amount of inches outside of it in any direction. Now, most of the ones in Code 1 are a standard straight line. So you would basically go, for example, with this one, the Lankai, he can deploy 4 inches outside of your deployment zone. Now, it still has to be within that 4 inches, so basically just means you get a 4-inch extension. Other models, like Casanova, he has plus 8 inches on his forward deployment, so he can go 8 inches out. Now, you still have to apply by all the same rules, so when he's deployed, you can deploy him prone, you can deploy them in cover, you can deploy them on scenery. So just bear in mind that the standard deployment rules still apply, but you get that added extra distance applied to it. Now, there are a couple of interesting examples here. So obviously with Lankai and with Casanova, what you saw was that it's in that top section, which means that whichever profile you choose below that, all of those get the benefit of that forward deployment rule. Now, when we look at something like the Crusher, for example, they don't have a general unit rule. They've actually got it within one of their set profiles. So if you chose that profile, you would get forward deployment. But if you chose one of the others, you wouldn't. So it's worth bearing in mind as to where that keyword is used dictates as to whether every profile you choose would get that benefit or whether it's only a specific profile within that model. So next, we have infiltration. Infiltration is a very standard rule. Any model that has that can deploy anywhere on your half of the table. Very straightforward. That's why we like it. So in this example, we've got 2 models. We've got the Gangbuster. He has infiltration, so he can deploy up to the halfway line. And we also have the Razor, who can deploy up to the halfway line. Now, it's at this point I'm going to touch upon that kind of curly rule that I mentioned. Doesn't directly affect deployment, but it's something to definitely factor in whilst deploying. Camouflage. So if any of your unit profiles have the camouflage keyword, that means they're allowed to deploy as a camouflage token instead of the model. So in this example, the Razor, instead of it deploying as an uncamouflaged version of itself, it could actually deploy as a camouflage token. Still applying by the same rules, so you could put that camo marker prone or standing up, and it could be hiding behind cover. So your infiltration rule would still apply, but you'd be able to do it with a camouflage token instead of the model itself. Parachutist. Parachutist is a slightly different one. These models don't deploy during the deployment phase. So with most other deployment types, during that deployment phase, which is obviously as part of the pre-game kind of working, you would deploy your models. And then your opponent would deploy their models. So with Parachutist, these guys work slightly different. You don't deploy them during the deployment phase, and their existence is private information. So your opponent doesn't actually have to know they exist until they come onto the table. So how they work is that if you decide to, you could start them off the table, and at any turn, when it is your active turn, you would use a private order that they hold on their own to bring them onto the table. Now, it's a long skill, so you spend that order to bring them on and then you can't do anything else. And with a parachutist, the rule around it is that you can walk on through any table edge. So you would basically place the model on the edge of the table in contact with the edge of the table, but on any edge that is not in your opponent's deployment zone. There's another couple of special rules around this. You can't bring them on in contact with a scenario objective. You can't bring them on so that they benefit from cover. You can't bring them on in contact with an enemy or neutral model or a marker. But other than that, you're free to bring them on almost however you like. It's worth noting that any model that isn't on the table doesn't contribute to your order pool for the duration of them being off the table. So for example, if you brought on a parachutist model in turn 2, for all of your turn 1, their order would not be contributing towards your order pool. Now, because they weren't on the table when you generated orders, they also don't generate an order that round. So you kind of got to bear that in mind with your strategy, is how long can you put off having their order contribute to your order pool. Now, they obviously can have orders spent on them once they've come on. So that is worth noting, is that you can still do stuff with them in the round that they come on, but they're basically pulling orders from your order pool, whilst not contributing to it. It's a very selfish relationship parachutists have with your order. So let's talk about a slightly more complex one, which is combat jump. For example, this Delta has combat jump, and so it can choose to come onto the table anywhere it likes. So if it uses combat jump, what you do is you place the model where you ideally want it to drop, but then you make a roll against that model's pH value. If the result of that roll is the same as or lower than the model's pH value, then the model gets to stay where it is and it's deployed there. But if you fail, that model then has to go back into your deployment zone and has to deploy touching one of the table edges within your deployment zone. So it's a bit of a risky business, but the rewards can pay off. Now I just want to talk quickly about AROs and parachutists and combat jumpists. When you bring the model on, it would attract AROs. So this is another thing that you've got to factor in when you're bringing on a combat jump or a parachutist. If you bring it on a table edge, or if you drop it on the top of a rooftop, any model that can see it once it's landed, spending its order to come in, gets to have an ARO, which might involve shooting it. So just factor that in with placement. You don't necessarily want to drop them somewhere where lots of models can see them, because they're going to get shot at, or they're going to have dodges or other things happen to them. So just factor that in. So what happens if a combat jump or a parachutist has a peripheral model? Like this Delta with Yudbot. Apologies that these haven't been painted yet. They're a recent addition to my collection, having only just been released by Corvus Belli. But I thought I'd use them to demonstrate how that would work. So both models stay off the table while they're kind of in reserve. One order brings them both onto the table. Now, the Delta and the Yudbot have both the combat jump and the parachutist keyword, so they can choose to deploy using either of those styles. But because they're one unit, you have to use the same style for both models. So you couldn't, say, bring the Yudbot on using the parachutist keyword and walk it on the side of the table, and then use the Delta using the combat jump. Because they're using the one order to come on, you've got to use the same style for both. So let's take the example that they're both deciding to combat jump in. Now with peripheral rules, they don't have to be within line of sight each other when they drop, and they don't have to be within a certain distance of each other when they drop in. So like in this example, I'm going to pop the Delta right here on top of this roof, and I'm going to put the Yudbot back here. In order to determine whether that drop has succeeded, I would make one roll against the Delta's pH value. And if it's successful, both models would successfully land where they want. If I fail, both models would fail and they'd both have to deploy touching the table edge in my deployment zone. Now again, remember that AROs can be attracted on one or both of those models. So if the Delta lands and a model can see the Delta, then that model could ARO on the Delta. Just because it can't see the Yudbot doesn't mean that it now doesn't get an ARO at all. And the same would happen if someone could see the Yudbot and not the Delta. They'd actually be able to do an ARO against the Yudbot. I won't get too much into the complexities around AROs and things with peripherals. That's a completely different video in its own right. But one thing I do want to kind of note before heading towards the wrap-up phase of this demo is that in deployment, remember that you have to hold back a model during deployment phase. So for example, I've got 10 models, and just for the purpose of this, all of them have standard deployment, normal deployment, nothing fancy. I would deploy 9 of those models, and then I would hold back my 10th. My opponent would then deploy 9 of their models and hold back their 10th. Then I would play my 10th model, and then they would play their 10th model. Now things obviously get a little bit complex when you've got parachutists and combat jumpers in your list, because, you know, they're off your list and they can't be seen and things like that. But the same applies. So what you would do is you would deploy all of your standard deployment models bar 1, hold that one back, and then deploy that as per normal, knowing that all of your parachutist and your combat jump models are off the table and are not included in that deployment phase, but they're also not generating orders either. Now obviously in terms of deployment and in Code 1, because you're only ever limited to 10 orders for an army list, you can kind of know that if your opponent only has 9 orders when they start and has only deployed 9 models, you can safely assume that one is potentially going to be dropping in or coming in as a parachutist or a combat jump. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at your opponent and what they've done, because that might impact your own deployment in terms of things like your facings. If you know that they've potentially got something that could combat jump in, you might want to deploy a little bit more defensively so that if something comes in behind you, you might be able to attract an ARO or something like that. Now you can see why I'm steering a bit clear of deployment strategies is because there's a lot that is situational. However, it's good to kind of pay attention now that you know how parachutist and combat jump works. Now you're a little bit more informed when you're going up against your opponent and what you might be able to expect about withheld troopers and withheld information. Hopefully that's been helpful for you in understanding the different types of deployments with most of the major armies for Code 1. Even though this is focused a lot on O12 because those are the models I have available, the rules still apply no matter which faction you're facing. Pop down in the comments any questions you've got about deployment in Code 1. And if you disagree with some of those rules, or if you've got an opinion as to whether that combat jump with peripherals was interpreted correctly, let me know. If you've got a link to something that maybe disproves that it's a single role for both models, please feel free to drop that in the comments. And obviously check those out to see if there's any changes in information. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. As always, you can follow me on Instagram if you want to see pictures of painting updates and see what else is going on. And always subscribe so that you can see when new videos are coming. I'm not making promises, but right now I've been on a bit of a pattern of releasing one every single week, and I'm hoping to keep that going for as long as possible. So subscribe to get notified as to when a more recent video drops. Thank you very much for your support, and I'll see you with my next video soon.